just in general, when you read Scripture through the lens of your theological system, regardless of what that system is, okay, your interpretation of Scripture will always conform to the system, even if it's unbiblical.
What is amillennialism? What is premillennialism?
Yeah, so the term itself, millennium, in biblical context, in the discussions that we find ourselves today, the millennium refers to the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. We see in that passage, verses 1 through 10, we see that term 1,000 years used 6 times. We see it's a period of time of designated 1,000 years in which Satan will be bound, Christ will reign. And so the key issue, as we think about that 1,000-year period in Revelation 20, the key issue in this debate involves the timing and the nature of the millennium, which is to say when it will happen and what it will consist of. So as you think about two of the major millennial views, premillennialism and amillennialism, premillennialism is the view that Christ, we all believe that he'll come again. Premillennialism says that Christ will return prior to, the millennium. And so his coming is premillennial. And so he'll come again, he'll establish his kingdom on this earth. It'll be an earthly kingdom. He will reign here upon the earth for this 1,000-year period. And so the millennium, according to premillennialism, is future. And then after that millennium, what we'll find in Scripture, we see that later in Revelation 20, the final judgment, and then the ushering in of the new heavens and earth. So real simply, if you think of it in terms of a sequence, you'd have second coming, millennium, eternal state. That's premillennialism in a nutshell. Now, amillennialism says that the millennium is not future. The millennium is now. The millennium is the present age. The 1,000 years, it's not a literal 1,000 years. It's a symbolic period, a long period of time between the first coming and the second coming of Christ. And so it's the present age. And the idea of the millennial reign in amillennialism, Jesus, he reigns, but not here on earth. He reigns spiritually from heaven throughout the present age. Then at the end of the present age, according to amillennialism, Jesus returns. We see the final resurrection, final judgment, and then the eternal state. So back to the sequence, amillennialism, very simple sequence, sees second coming, eternal state. So the difference is obvious. Premillennialism, second coming, millennium, eternal state. Amillennialism, second coming, eternal state. No millennial kingdom in between. And so really, if I were to boil it down to a single question, it would be this. Is the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 a future physical reign of Christ on earth or a present spiritual reign of Christ from heaven? That's really the essence of the debate between the two. Is the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 a future physical reign of Christ on earth? That's premillennialism. Or is it a present spiritual reign of Christ from heaven? That would be amillennialism.
Yeah, I think that's a great question to ask, and that helps people sort out what they've been taught and what they hold to. Now, you alluded to this earlier, Dr. Waymeyer, but I think a lot of people listening to this episode will kind of ask, well, why does this matter? Hermeneutically speaking, why does this matter? As a matter of Bible interpretation, why is the question of the timing of Jesus' return in relation to the millennium important?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the reason, Aaron, that it's such a crucial question is because ultimately, I believe the reason that you have divergent eschatologies between otherwise like-minded men who have a high view of the Word ultimately does go back to this issue of hermeneutics, or what we call the principles of Bible interpretation. How do we approach the text? We want to approach the text understanding. The goal is to understand, as we come to any given passage, what did the original author communicate to the original audience in that original context. It's sort of the goal of the grammatical historical method. So as I think about amillennialism and what are the hermeneutical tendencies that result in amillennialism that I believe are errant, and it's hard to say this would be true of all of them. It's kind of a broad brush, but I think in terms of big picture tendencies, I think there are two main problems with what I would call the amillennial hermeneutic. First one is that amillennials tend to use the New Testament to reinterpret Old Testament prophecy. In other words, you come to Old Testament prophecy rather than coming to that passage, interpreting the Old Testament passage on its own terms, in its own context. What the amillennialists will do oftentimes is interpret the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. And so they believe in what's sometimes called New Testament priority. Now, why is that a problem? Well, I believe that's a problem because the result then, I don't think that there's anything nefarious going on here. It's different hermeneutic, right? But what the result is, they end up denying, in my view, the straightforward meaning of some very important Old Testament prophecies. So you have some prophecies in the Old Testament speaking of Messiah returning, coming to reign in Jerusalem from the throne of David. You see, as part of that time, you see the nation of Israel being restored to the promised land, all of this in fulfillment of the covenant promises, all of this fulfilled during the millennial reign of Christ. But the amillennials looks through the New Testament lens and believes there's somewhat of a reinterpretation going on in which they interpret those passages to be fulfilled in the church, either in the present age or in the eternal state, but not the nation of Israel fulfilled in what we would call the millennial kingdom. Now, why is that a problem? And I'll just kind of boil it down. To say that the New Testament reinterprets the Old Testament in such a way to assign a new and different meaning to Old Testament prophecy than what was communicated by the original author to the original audience in that original context is a problem for a few reasons. Number one, it denies the perspicuity of the Old Testament. Perspicuity just being a fancy word for clarity. In other words, if the New Testament, think about it, if the New Testament is the interpretive key that unlocks the meaning of the Old, then the original recipients of the Old Testament who didn't have the luxury of looking through that lens, they would be completely in the dark as to the true meaning of these prophecies. So it denies the perspicuity, the clarity of the Old Testament. It denies that these promises will be fulfilled as they're originally communicated. It denies the unity of Scripture in which all of divine revelation, Old Testament, New Testament, is consistent with itself. And then lastly, I think it ultimately drives what I would call an unbiblical wedge between the intention of the divine author and the intention of the human author, so that the human author meant what he meant in the original context, but God meant something more than that, meant something different, in fact, than that. And so that would be the first issue. I think the second one would be this, is involving Revelation 20, and I think we'll probably come back to this passage, so I'll keep this brief. But I believe hermeneutically, the tendency of the amillennialist when they come to Revelation 20, which I believe is the key passage in this debate, they tend to read Revelation 20 through the interpretive lens of amillennialism. Now, just in general, when you read Scripture through the lens of your theological system, regardless of what that system is, okay, your interpretation, if that's your lens, you're reading through this lens, here's my system, I'm reading everything I read in Scripture through that lens, your interpretation of Scripture will always conform to the system and therefore will always confirm the system, even if it's unbiblical. And that's a problem because what it may be doing is cutting you off from much needed correction or possibly some refinement in your system, your theological beliefs. And it ultimately doesn't allow the Bible to say what it wants to say. The mantra I always tell my theology students, let your exegesis determine your theology. Don't let your theology determine your exegesis. And I would say, generally speaking, that's what amillennials tend to do with Revelation 20. Let their amillennial theological system determine their exegesis of that passage.
Well put. That last point you just mentioned, Dr. Waymeyer, reminds me of the old Bernard Ram quote from Protestant Biblical Interpretation, where he mentions building our theology brick by brick via exegesis, and you build up from that foundation.